abandoned to die in the snow, the crippled daughter was rescued by the vampire king. The world seemed a blur of white, an endless, biting landscape that mirrored the emptiness she had felt all her life. She had been abandoned. The king, her father, had turned his back on her long ago. She was not the strong heir he had hoped for. No, she was weak, broken, cursed with a limp that turned every step into a painful reminder of her inadequacy. He had never wanted her, never loved her. To him, she was nothing more than a burden, an obstacle that prevented the kingdom from reaching its full potential. So he had left her to die. Left her to the unforgiving cold of the mountains, where the winds howled like vengeful spirits. Her mother's voice, once tender and filled with love, had been silenced long ago. And now, all that remained was the freezing silence of abandonment. Isolde had once been a princess. Once her father had held her in his arms and her mother had sung songs of hope to her at night. But those days were gone, and so was any trace of kindness in the royal halls. Now she was just a girl, cold, alone, and desperate to hold on to life. Her leg was bleeding. The cut from her fall earlier had reopened, the snow pressing against it like the hands of ghosts. Her fingers were numb, barely able to grip the small pack she had managed to carry with her. The last of her food was gone, and the water in her flask had frozen solid. Each step she took was a battle, each breath, a fight for survival. Her eyes began to blur with exhaustion, and the world around her faded into darkness. She could feel the end drawing closer, the icy fingers of death wrapping themselves around her. And yet, as she collapsed onto the snow, unable to rise again, there was no anger in her heart, only a strange sense of peace. She had known this moment would come. The howling winds grew louder. Isolde closed her eyes, ready to surrender to the cold, to let the darkness claim her. But before she could fully give in, she felt something, an unfamiliar presence. It was unlike anything she had ever known. The air grew heavier, a strange, oppressive weight pressing down on her. And then the sound of footsteps. Isolde opened her eyes. In the distance, through the swirling snow, a figure approached. At first she thought it might be a hallucination, a trick of her fading mind. But as the figure drew closer, she saw him clearly. A man, tall and cloaked in shadow, his face hidden beneath a hood. His movements were swift, almost predatory. He walked with an authority that made the ground beneath him tremble, as though nature itself bent to his will. Her vision blurred once again, but she saw his eyes. They were red, glowing like embers in the dark. His gaze pierced through her, and for a moment the world around her seemed to stop. Then, in the next instant, the man was beside her. "Why are you out here?" His voice was deep, commanding, like thunder on the horizon. Isolde tried to speak, but her throat was dry, cracked from the cold. She could barely lift her head, and her body seemed to betray her, too weak to move. She struggled, her mind desperate to make sense of what was happening. The man leaned closer, his presence overwhelming. She could feel his power, a dark, ancient energy that radiated from him like a storm waiting to break. His gaze softened, though only slightly, as if studying her. He knelt beside her, his movements swift and precise. "You are not meant to die here," he murmured. "Not today." Before Isolde could understand what he meant, a cold hand reached out and touched her forehead. She gasped, feeling the shock of his touch race through her. It was like nothing she had ever known, powerful, electrifying, and yet somehow soothing. A strange warmth spread through her, and the pain in her leg seemed to fade. Who are you?" Isolde whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he stood, his eyes scanning the horizon as if sensing something far beyond her. His cloak billowed in the wind, and his face remained hidden beneath the hood. "I am Lyran," he said finally, "King of the North." His words sent a shiver down her spine. A king, here, in this desolate place, but she had no strength to ask more questions. Darkness was beginning to close in again, the cold pressing against her chest, threatening to swallow her whole. Lyran knelt once more, lifting her into his arms with ease as though she weighed nothing. Isolde barely registered the movement, her mind slipping further away. She wanted to resist, to fight, but the exhaustion was too great. She closed her eyes, her last thoughts filled with confusion and disbelief. Why had he saved her? The journey back to his castle was a blur. When she woke, she was no longer lying in the snow but in a vast, dimly lit chamber. The walls were made of ice, shimmering with an eerie blue glow. The air was cold, but there was no biting wind here. The strange warmth from before lingered, as though the castle itself was alive with an ancient energy. Isolde tried to sit up but found herself too weak. Her leg ached, but it wasn't as bad as before. She looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The room was barren, nothing but stone and ice, save for a large bed where she lay. "Rest," a voice commanded from the shadows. Isolde's head turned toward the sound, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was Lyron. His eyes glowed with an unsettling red hue, his dark cloak swirling around him like mist. He looked like a figure out of a nightmare, a creature of the cold and dark, but there was something in his gaze, something that suggested more than just power. Isolde opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She could only stare at him, her body still too weak to fully comprehend what was happening. "I saved you," he said, his voice steady, almost cold. "You owe me nothing." Isolde swallowed hard. The silence in the room was thick, oppressive, but she found herself unable to look away from him. She began, but the words escaped her, her throat dry and tight. "Why?" Lyron took a step closer, his movements predatory and graceful. "Because you are not meant to die, Isolde. Not yet. There is something about you, something that calls to me." Isolde felt a tremor in her chest at the mention of her name. No one had ever said it with such authority, such weight. It felt as if he knew her, as if he had always known her. But how? Why? Lyron's gaze never wavered. He watched her like a wolf watches its prey, curious, yet distant. He didn't smile, but there was something almost pitying in the way he regarded her. "I will keep you here," he continued, his voice low, "until you understand, until you realize your purpose." Isolde's heart raced. She didn't know what he meant by that, but the fear that had begun to settle in her chest grew. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to owe him anything. But her body was weak, and the king's presence, his power, was too overwhelming to resist. She had no choice but to stay. As she lay back, the icy chill of the room enveloping her once more, she couldn't help but wonder what fate had brought her here. Was she truly a pawn in some greater game? Or was there something more to Lyron's words, something she couldn't yet understand? All she knew for certain was that her life had changed forever, and that, for better or worse, she was no longer alone. The days blurred together for Isolde. The icy walls of Lyron's castle felt like a world apart from everything she had known, a world of warmth, sunlight, and hope that seemed so far removed from her reality now. The cold, crystalline walls seemed to close in around her, a constant reminder of her isolation. She couldn't remember how long she had been here, only that every day felt the same, a strange mixture of silence and the slow burn of growing curiosity. She had tried to leave once. It had been the second day after waking in the castle. Weak, fragile from her near-death experience in the snow, she had stumbled out of bed, clutching the edge of the wall for support. She hadn't known where she was going, only that she had to escape. The vast hallways stretched endlessly before her, lined with frozen statues that glinted in the pale light, their frozen forms as lifeless as the silence around her. But she hadn't gotten far. Lyron had found her, as though he had been waiting for her. He appeared suddenly, his presence heavy, like the weight of a storm cloud before the rain. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it that sent a chill through her. She had tried to stand tall to meet his gaze. "I don't belong here," she had said, her voice shaking. "I was abandoned. You saved me, but I'm not yours to keep." Lyran had said nothing at first, just watched her with those eyes, so dark, so ancient, like the depths of a forgotten abyss. Then, without warning, he had stepped forward, his hand wrapping around her wrist with a grip so firm it almost hurt. "You belong to this place now," he had said. "You belong to me." The words, cold and final, sent a shock through her. She had tried to pull away, but he was far too strong. The sense of helplessness she had felt in the snow returned, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. She was still the weak, abandoned princess, nothing more than a prisoner in a frozen kingdom. But instead of resisting, she had simply stood there, trembling. And Lyran had let her go, his cold eyes scanning her as if he had already read her soul. "You are free to leave whenever you wish," he had said, though the tone of his voice suggested otherwise. "But know this, you will find nothing but emptiness in the world outside these walls." And so she had stayed. For days, weeks perhaps, time seemed to slip by unnoticed. It wasn't that Isolde didn't want to leave. She did, but something kept her here. Something she couldn't explain. Lyran had never been cruel. He was cold, yes, distant and imposing. But there was an air of sorrow around him, a depth to his silence that she couldn't ignore. She often found herself staring at him when he wasn't looking, trying to piece together the fragments of his life from the few words he had spoken. He never shared much about himself. He rarely spoke of the curse that had brought him to this place, the curse that had made him the vampire king of this frozen realm. She had once overheard him speaking to someone in the hall, a low conversation in a language she didn't understand. It had been fleeting, but there had been something in his tone that made her stop, something that hinted at pain, loss, a lifetime of suffering. Isolde couldn't help but wonder if his curse was the same as hers. Was she too cursed in some way? Had fate drawn them together? She had asked him about it once. One quiet evening, as they stood near the large window overlooking the snow-covered plains, she had gathered the courage to ask. "Why did you save me?" she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You say I'm not meant to die. But why?" "What do you want from me?" Lyran had not looked at her. Instead, he had kept his eyes on the snow, his expression unreadable. "I saved you," he had replied slowly, "because you are not like the others." She had been confused by his words. "What do you mean?" "The others," he had repeated. "The ones who abandoned you. They are not like you. You are different." Isolde had wanted to ask more, but something in his tone had silenced her. He was offering her no answers, only more questions. And the more she stayed in his presence, the more she realized how little she understood about him, about his world. There were moments, though, when his mask seemed to crack. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the castle fell into shadow, Lyran had spoken to her again, but this time his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I was like you once," he had said, his gaze distant, lost in the past. "I was cast aside, discarded. Not by my family, but by the very gods themselves." Isolde had been startled by his words. She had never seen him this way, so vulnerable, so human. She had taken a cautious step forward, her voice quiet. "What happened?" His eyes flicked to her, his gaze heavy. "I was born with a bloodline cursed to never know peace, to never know love, to be eternal, yes, but always alone, always cold." The word lingered in the air between them, a bitter truth that Isolde could almost taste. She hadn't known what to say. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like to live forever, to be cursed with immortality, and yet never truly belong anywhere. She had suffered in her own way, but the depth of his pain was something she couldn't fully understand. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Isolde's heart ached with the weight of it, and she found herself yearning to say something, anything, that might ease the tension in the air. But before she could speak, Lyran had turned, his posture stiff, the mask of the vampire king slipping back into place. "You should rest," he had said, his voice now cold and final like the closing of a door. And so she had gone to bed once more, the conversation hanging in the air like a phantom she couldn't shake. The walls of the castle felt even colder that night, though the fire in the hearth burned brightly. Days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. There were no loud arguments, no sudden explosions of emotion, just silence. Yet with each passing day, Isolde could feel the pull of something between her and Lyran, something that neither of them could ignore. She was drawn to him, though she couldn't explain why. Her heart stirred with a mix of fear and something else, something deeper, darker. It wasn't just the power he exuded, though that was undeniable. It wasn't just his coldness or the strange, magnetic presence he had in every room he entered. It was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel as if she were both the key to his salvation and the weapon that would destroy him. Lyran, too, seemed aware of this tension, though he never acknowledged it. He continued to care for her in his own way, never too close, never too distant, but always there when she needed him. He had helped her regain strength after her near death in the snow, had brought her food and medicine when her body had protested. And yet, every time she tried to speak of the bond that seemed to form between them, he would retreat into silence. But there were moments when she saw something in his eyes, something that made her wonder if he, too, was feeling the pull between them. His gaze would linger a little too long, his voice soft when he spoke to her, and she would catch a glimpse of something like longing beneath the layers of control. And then, one night, as they sat near the fire, the silence shattered. "You should leave," Lyran said abruptly, his tone sharp like a blade cutting through the air. Isolde blinked, surprised by the suddenness of his words. "What? You don't belong here," he continued, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "This place is not for you. I am not what you need." Her heart skipped a beat. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't go back, not after everything." Lyran's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. For a moment he looked as if he were battling something inside himself. Then he turned away. "You will leave, Isolde. It is the only way." And with that he was gone, leaving her staring into the fire, her heart heavy with confusion and fear. Cliffhanger. And then from behind her, Lyran's voice echoed, a warning in the air. "You must not trust them." Isolde's world had shifted, the ground beneath her trembling with uncertainty. The storm had passed, but the air inside Lyran's castle felt heavier than ever. It wasn't the cold that bothered her. It was the unspoken tension between them, an invisible thread that pulled her closer to him with each passing day. She had not left the castle, though she longed to. The outside world, though once so familiar, now seemed distant, unreachable, as though she had crossed into another life. It was a world of shadows, one where her existence was woven with the same dark threads that defined Lyran's existence. She felt it each time their eyes met, the electric tension that passed between them. Lyran never spoke of it. He remained distant, his icy demeanor a wall she couldn't breach. He was always around, watching her, observing her every movement, but rarely did he offer any explanation for why she remained in his castle. Why had he saved her? What did he want from her? One evening, as the castle's torches flickered in the growing darkness, she found herself standing before the large, ornate mirror in her room. The reflection that stared back at her was unfamiliar, a girl she barely recognized. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, but it was the look in them that caught her attention, the longing, the confusion. For so long, she had been a prisoner of her own life, trapped by her father's rejection and the curse that had marked her from birth. But now, in this icy fortress, it felt as if she was a prisoner of something far more powerful, something she couldn't name. It was Lyran, his presence, his power, his dominance over her heart. She tried to ignore it, but it was there, just beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing day. As if summoned by her thoughts, Lyran appeared in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, watching her, but the moment he stepped into the room, the air thickened. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Why?" Isolde's heart raced at the sound of his voice, but she stood tall, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "I'm not avoiding you," she replied, her voice steady, though her insides twisted with uncertainty. "I just don't understand why I'm still here." Lyron stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're here because I saved you. You're here because there is no place for you outside these walls." His gaze flickered for a moment, and Isolde caught the faintest trace of something else, something vulnerable. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of the Vampire King. "I don't want to be here," she whispered, though she knew the words would hurt her more than they would hurt him. "I don't belong in this place, Lyron. I don't belong to you." He stopped in front of her, so close that she could feel the heat of his presence, like a fire that threatened to burn her. He reached out and tilted her chin with a single finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, haunted, and there was something in them that made her pulse quicken. "You belong to no one," he said softly, almost tenderly. "Not anymore, not after everything you've been through." Isolde didn't know how to respond. She wanted to shout at him, to demand answers, but she was too afraid. Afraid of what he might say, afraid of what might happen if she pushed him too far. But in that moment, she felt something stir deep inside her, a longing that wasn't just for answers, but for him. A part of her, a part she had buried so long ago, ached for the connection, for the intimacy she had never known. "I saved you," he said again, this time his voice heavy with something she couldn't place. "But you are not the only one who needs saving." Isolde frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Lyron's eyes softened for the briefest moment before he turned away. He took a few steps toward the window, his silhouette a dark shadow against the moonlight. "I didn't ask for this life," he murmured, his voice distant as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "I didn't choose it, but here I am, bound by blood and curse, forced to live in this endless void. I cannot escape it. And I cannot let anyone close enough to understand the darkness I carry." Isolde felt a pang of sympathy in her chest. She didn't fully understand what he was saying, but there was something in his tone that hinted at a deep, unspeakable sorrow. It mirrored the loneliness she had felt for so long, the feeling of being trapped in a life she never wanted. "Lyron," she began, her voice trembling, I don't know what's happening between us, but I can feel it. The way you look at me, the way I feel when I'm near you. I don't know what to do with it." He turned back to her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that took her breath away. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, leaving only the two of them in the room. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, feel the heat rising to her cheeks. "You're not the only one who feels it," he said quietly, "but I cannot allow it. Not now. Not when everything I've built could be destroyed." Isolde took a step forward, her hands trembling at her sides. "What are you afraid of?" Lyron's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "I'm afraid of losing control." The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Isolde didn't understand fully what he meant, but the weight of his fear was undeniable. She could feel it radiating off him, a darkness that threatened to consume them both. "You've already lost control," she whispered, though she barely recognized her own voice. It was as though she had spoken a truth that neither of them could escape. She took another step closer, her breath shallow. "You're not as in control as you think, Lyron, not when it comes to me." He looked at her, his eyes narrowing with an unreadable expression. "You think you know me, Isolde," he said, his voice low, "but you don't. You have no idea what I've done, what I am. I am not like the others. I am not the kind of man you should want." Isolde felt her heart break at his words. She knew he was hiding something, hiding a part of himself he wasn't ready to share, but she couldn't let him push her away. Not again. "You're more than just what you've done, Lyron," she said softly. "You're not a monster, not to me." For a moment, he looked at her as if she had just shattered something inside him. The walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to falter, just for an instant, and she saw the pain he had kept hidden for so long. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the mask returned. He stepped back, his eyes hardening once more. "I'm not what you think," he said, his voice colder than before. "You should leave, Isolde, before it's too late." Isolde stared at him, the hurt in her chest growing. But she wasn't going to leave, not this time. Not when she could feel the pull between them as strong and unyielding as a storm. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside her. "I won't run anymore." Lyron's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, and for a heartbeat it seemed as if he might say something more. But then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone, her heart racing, her mind swirling with 1,000 unspoken words. Cliffhanger. Isolde's pulse quickened. This woman, she knew her. And as the figure turned, she spoke in a voice that sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. "The prophecy is true. The blood of the king and queen will rise." But at what cost? Isolde stood frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat as the mysterious woman in the dark cloak turned toward her. Her face remained hidden, obscured by the shadows of her hood, but the power emanating from her was unmistakable. It was as though the very air around her trembled in response. The figure spoke again, her voice clear and chilling. "You've come far, princess, farther than most would dare." Isolde's heart pounded in her chest. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up inside her. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her long cloak swirling behind her like a shadow. And for the first time, Isolde felt the cold, the ancient chill of a force far older and more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. She instinctively took a step back, her gaze never leaving the woman. "The blood of the king and queen will rise," the figure said again, her voice heavy with significance. "But it is not without consequence." Isolde's mind raced. "The king and queen," she repeated. "What do you mean? Are you speaking of Lyron and me?" The woman nodded slowly, her eyes glinting from beneath her hood. "You are the key, Isolde. The prophecy has been foretold. You, the daughter of royalty, and Lyron, the vampire king, your blood, when combined, will either save or destroy this world." The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating and overwhelming. Isolde's pulse quickened. "I don't understand. Why me? Why now?" The figure stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You are not just a princess. You are the last of a bloodline that was meant to merge with the vampire kings in order to end the curse. But the path you are on, it is fraught with peril. If you choose this destiny, there will be no going back. And if you fail—" She trailed off, and Isolde felt a chill run through her, as if something dark and terrible had just brushed against her soul. "How do I know I can trust you?" Isolde asked, her voice trembling. The woman's eyes glinted with a strange sadness. "Trust is a fragile thing," she replied. "But trust in this. Your future and Lyron's are intertwined. The gods have spoken. Your choices will shape the fate of more than just this kingdom." The woman turned, beginning to walk away, but paused just before disappearing into the trees. "Remember this, Isolde. The prophecy is not just about the merging of blood. It is about the price that must be paid for redemption." Isolde stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning. The woman's words echoed in her ears like a haunting melody, one that seemed to promise both hope and despair in equal measure. That night, Isolde couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with questions, and Lyron's face, etched with pain and power, haunted her thoughts. She had tried to resist him, to distance herself from the pull she felt between them, but the truth of the prophecy was clear now. She was part of something much larger than herself. But what was she to do with this knowledge? Her heart yearned for him, yet she couldn't ignore the growing fear that this path would lead to destruction. The woman had spoken of a price that would be paid, but she hadn't said what that price was. The silence of the castle was oppressive, as though even the walls were waiting for something to happen. The only sound was the occasional creak of the stone beneath her feet, the distant howl of wolves in the night. Isolde couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing near, something that would change everything. She made her way to the grand hall, where the dim light from the torches flickered against the stone walls. Lyron's presence was always strong here, like an unspoken force that seemed to fill every corner of the room. But tonight, the hall was empty, except for Lyron, who stood near the window, his back to her, gazing out at the snow-covered land beyond. His figure seemed almost otherworldly in the faint light, a shadow in a world of shadows. "Lyron!" Isolde's voice was soft, but it broke the silence like a whisper in the night. He didn't turn immediately. His posture was stiff, his shoulders tense. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "You've learned of the prophecy," he said, his back still to her. Isolde stepped closer, her heart in her throat. "I have," she admitted. "I don't understand what it all means, but I know it's true." Lyron turned to face her, his red eyes gleaming in the dim light. "It is true," he said quietly, "but knowing the truth does not make it any easier." His voice held a trace of sadness, and for the first time, Isolde saw something raw in him, something that resembled fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lyron's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Because I did not want you to be burdened by it. I wanted you to have a choice, Isolde. A choice to live your life free of the weight of this prophecy. But I don't have a choice now," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "We are bound by it, by fate, by blood, by something neither of us can control." Lyron stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You are not a prisoner of fate, you never were, but the prophecy, it's inevitable whether we want it or not." Isolde's heart clenched. "What does that mean for us, Lyron? What do we do now?" He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was gentle, but it burned with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. His gaze held hers, and for a moment the room seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them. "We fight," he said softly. "We fight for control. We fight for redemption." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. But as he spoke, Isolde could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the king he had become and the man who longed for something more. His heart, though hard as stone, was not as unfeeling as he would have liked to believe. "You can't control everything, Lyron," Isolde said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can't control me." His eyes darkened slightly, but there was a flicker of understanding in them. "No, I cannot, but you must understand, Isolde. The power that resides in us, in our blood, it will not be ignored." The tension in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. Isolde knew what he meant. This was not just about their feelings for one another. This was about the fate of their world, a fate that they could not escape. She stood still, her chest heavy with the weight of what was to come. The prophecy was true, and she and Lyron were bound by it, whether they liked it or not. Their blood, their very existence, was part of a design that could bring salvation or destruction. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to be," Lyron replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But we don't have a choice. This is our path, Isolde, and we must walk it together." Cliffhanger. Lyron's face hardened and he stepped in front of Isolde, his body a protective shield. "It's begun," the figure said, their voice hollow and cold. "The gods have made their move." Isolde's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing a face she knew all too well, the face of her father.